In California, the fastest path from renting to owning is not always in the hottest city. It is often in the places where rent leaves enough room to actually save. If you have been trying to move from renter to owner, that difference matters a lot. Because the gap between I want to buy a house and I can actually save for one usually comes down to monthly rent, not just home prices. California is full of expensive markets, but not every city drains a paycheck at the same speed. In some places, lower rent can create real breathing room, and that breathing room can make the down payment goal feel a lot more realistic. So today, we are looking at the California cities where lower rent may make saving easier, and where the path from renter to owner might actually be less impossible than it looks. Before we get into the list, there is one important thing to understand. The best city for saving is not always the cheapest city on paper. It is the city where rent is low enough to free up cash, but the rest of the housing market is still realistic enough that ownership does not feel completely out of reach. That means we are looking for a balance. We want cities with lower monthly rent, but also places where the cost of buying a home does not explode so fast that the savings never catch up. We also want markets where renters can still find jobs, commute options, or remote work flexibility that make the move practical. That is the real question here. Where can a renter build savings without feeling like every dollar disappears into housing? One of the clearest examples is Bakersfield. Bakersfield has long stood out as one of California's more affordable large cities, and that matters if you are trying to save for a down payment. Lower rent means more room in the monthly budget, and more room in the budget means more money can go towards savings instead of just staying trapped in housing costs. That does not mean Bakersfield is a magic solution. You still have to deal with local wages, commute patterns, and the broader trade-off of living farther from the coast. But for renters who are tired of watching most of their paycheck go straight to rent, Bakersfield can create a very different financial picture, and that is the key point. When rent is lower, even by a few $100s a month, the savings effect adds up fast over a year. That money can cover an emergency fund, closing costs, moving costs, or the first real step toward a down payment. Fresno is another city that often belongs in this conversation. Fresno gives renters a similar advantage in the sense that housing costs are generally lower than in California's coastal markets. That can make it easier to build a savings habit because the monthly pressure is not as intense. For a lot of people, saving for a home fails not because they do not want to save, but because rent makes saving inconsistent. A city like Fresno can help solve part of that problem by lowering the monthly baseline. It also has a strong appeal for people who want more space for the money. That matters because if you can get more manageable rent and still live in a market with practical everyday amenities, the idea of staying put long enough to save becomes more realistic. Of course, the trade-off is that not everyone's income will stretch the same way there. But for renters with stable work and a serious plan to buy, Fresno can be one of the stronger places to build momentum. Now let us move into Southern California, where the story gets a little more complicated. Riverside is interesting because it sits in that middle zone. It is not the cheapest market in the state, but compared with many parts of coastal Southern California, it can still offer meaningful rent relief. That matters because Riverside gives renters access to a much larger regional economy while still avoiding the extreme price pressure of the coast. For someone trying to save, that can be a big advantage. Instead of spending every month trying to survive a high coastal rent, a renter in Riverside may have a little more flexibility to redirect money into savings. And when you are building toward ownership, flexibility is everything. The trade-off is that Riverside is still part of a competitive Southern California housing environment. Home prices are not cheap just because rent is lower than the coast. But if the goal is to create a better savings path while staying in a larger metro area, Riverside deserves serious attention. San Bernardino belongs in the same conversation for similar reasons. San Bernardino has a reputation for being more affordable than many nearby Southern California markets, and that affordability can be a major advantage for renters trying to save. Lower rent is not just a nice perk here. It can be the difference between saving consistently and never getting ahead at all. That is especially important for first-time buyers. A renter trying to move into ownership usually needs more than just a down payment. They also need savings for inspections, moving expenses, emergency repairs, and the reality that owning a home comes with surprise costs. If rent is too high, all of that gets squeezed out. If rent is lower, the saving process becomes much more realistic. San Bernardino is not perfect, and it is not a one-size-fits-all answer. But for people who are serious about turning rent savings into ownership savings, it can be one of the more practical options in Southern California. Sacramento is another city worth watching. It is not always the first place people think about when they picture affordable California housing. But compared with the coastal markets, Sacramento can still offer a much better balance between rent and opportunity. That is what makes it useful in this conversation. Some renters do better in Sacramento because the city offers a mix of government jobs, private sector jobs, and broader regional access. That matters because lower rent alone is not enough. You still need a path to steady income if you want to save consistently. Sacramento can work well for people who want to stay in a major California city without paying the premium that comes with the coast. The savings math may not be as dramatic as it is in some inland markets, but it can still be enough to move the needle. And sometimes that is all a renter needs. Not a perfect market, just a market where the numbers finally start to make sense. Stockton is another strong candidate on this list. Stockton often gets attention because it offers a more affordable entry point than many other parts of California. And when the rent is lower, the path to savings gets much clearer. That is especially true for renters who are trying to build a first home fund from scratch. The reason Stockton stands out is simple. Lower rent can create a real surplus if the income is steady. That surplus can go straight into savings instead of disappearing into housing. This is the kind of market where a disciplined renter can actually make progress month after month. And in a state like California, that kind of progress is a big deal. Now, Stockton also comes with trade-offs, and that needs to be said clearly. The job market may not work for everyone, and some commuters may face longer travel times. But if the goal is to reduce housing pressure and accelerate savings, Stockton has a real place in the conversation. Modesto is another city where the savings story can make sense. Modesto does not get the same attention as the big coastal cities, but that is part of what makes it interesting. It can offer a lower-cost housing environment that gives renters more room to build financial momentum. And when the rent is lower, saving does not have to feel like a constant sacrifice. That is one of the biggest psychological benefits of an affordable market. You stop feeling like you are choosing between survival and progress. Instead, you can actually begin to separate the two. Modesto may not be the right fit for everyone, especially if someone needs a specific job market or a very short commute. But for the renter whose top priority is saving for ownership, it is the kind of city that can make the goal feel more achievable. Visalia is worth mentioning for the same reason. Visalia tends to fit the profile of a smaller, more affordable California market where lower rent can make a big difference. And when the monthly housing cost is manageable, renters may have a better chance of creating a steady saving routine. That is important because consistency matters more than almost anything else in the down payment process. Saving a little every month in a lower-cost city can be more effective than trying to save a larger amount in a market where rent keeps wiping out the budget. Visalia is especially relevant for renters who do not need to be in one of California's biggest economic centers every day. If flexibility is on your side, cities like this can open up a more practical route toward ownership. Now, there is one thing that applies to all of these markets. Lower rent does not automatically mean easy ownership. It just means the savings equation becomes more favorable. You still have to deal with home prices, interest rates, income levels, and the reality that California housing is expensive almost everywhere. But if you are renting in a city where monthly housing costs are lower, you have a much better shot at building the cash needed to buy. That is why this conversation matters. For renters, the path to ownership is often less about finding the perfect house and more about creating enough financial room to get started. A lower rent city can help with that in a way that a high-cost coastal market usually cannot. So who should be paying attention to these cities? First, first-time buyers who are serious about saving a down payment. If rent has been the main thing slowing you down, moving to a lower-cost market may change the math. Second, remote and hybrid workers. If your job gives you flexibility, you may have more room to choose a city based on affordability instead of proximity. Third, families who want stability. In many cases, lower rent means more predictable monthly budgeting, and that can make it easier to stay on track toward ownership. The real takeaway is simple. If your goal is to move from renter to owner in California, you need a city that gives you a fighting chance to save. And for many people, that means looking beyond the coast and focusing on places where rent is lower. The budget stretches further, and the path to ownership feels a little more real. Because in California, the right city can do more than lower your rent. It can change your timeline. If this breakdown was helpful, subscribe to Housing IQ for more data-driven California housing insights.